How does a legal eagle's mind work? Find out more by listening to the video of Aditya Sondi.
Okay, Aditya, thank you so much for coming on to this session of mine called Mind Talks. And I've been meaning to do this for so long, get into your mind because, I've heard some of your talks, I've seen some of your interviews, and I've read all the nice things that people have to say about you. And I'm saying, when do I get into Aditya's mind?
Thank you. Thank you for having me in.
For me, even more interesting is, Aditya, I've seen you as a kid grow up and how much of time we have spent together with your sister and brother-in-law, Ravina and Sundar, and your dad, Ravi, he's such a wonderful person.
Absolutely.
So, Aditya, now I'm just going to go through quickly your background. But before that, I thought I'll just give a brief on what is Mind Talks, because some of the people seeing our program for the first time might want to know what is Mind Talks. So Mind Talks is a session where I try to get into the mind of either successful people or leaders. And in your case, you fall under both these categories so beautifully. And I'm so indebted to you for having taken the opportunity to come on to this program. And I'm looking forward to a lot of learning from it. And I'm sure the people listening to this will get a lot out of it. So just for all of you to understand Dr. Aditya Sondi, I'm looking at it from just a Genesis viewpoint. Born in 1975, went to Bishop Cotton's school, went to National Law School of India University, and I think you were on the Bar Council at the age of 23, started your independent practice by 29, focusing on commercial and constitutional matters and arbitration. Then done cases in the Supreme Court, high courts, and many high courts. But I think the one thing that really got me fired up is, at 38 you were appointed as senior advocate by the Karnataka High Court. I'm thinking, wow, that is fabulous. At 41, additional advocate general for Karnataka. That is another landmark on its own. And you've also represented the governor of Karnataka as a special counsel. I also like this part of it, is that you contributed to the Oxford Handbook on the Indian Constitution. That itself is a wow on its own. But what makes me really jealous is, you've written these 2 books on your old school, and I was thinking this guy should have been in Joseph.
You wish.
So that was the only aha moment for me. But I'm so proud of you. Cricketer, played for under 15 Karnataka team, and just an all-rounder in as many ways as you can look at it. But more than anything else, Aditya, I want to compliment you for your niceness, your kindness. I've met you at parties, and you're so nice to talk to and always so engaging.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you.
So that's just for our listeners. But Aditya, anything that you want to add, in terms of who you are and how you look at life as a leader, as a successful person in law?
I mean, those are big words, Ian. For me, success and leadership is best gauged by others who come in contact with you. In fact, perhaps that's what keeps you real, right? That you stay honest to yourself and don't get carried away with things that it feels good to hear my life in a snapshot from you, but I know what it's taken to do all of these things, and it's been rough, and it's been a scrap many times. But I do things outside of this as well. I have a strong interest in theatre. I follow rugby, and I think the long and short of it is one should try and do things that feed your soul. It's not just work or accomplishment. I think it's an all-round thing to keep your heart happy and to evolve as a person. I mean, I've personally followed that model all my life. It's not about destinations or milestones. It's about how you're personally progressing within yourself intellectually, in terms of your value systems, in terms of your learning, and so on. So yeah, that's really my model.
Brilliant. So what wakes you up in the morning, Aditya?
Oh, it's actually my neighbor's maid who drums away above me at 6:30 in the morning. But more seriously, practice of the law, Ian, feels a bit like having an exam every day. You'll remember that feeling when we had our board exams in 10th standard. you're a little bit on edge, and you know you have to get up and you have a job to do, and it's a mix of nervousness and anticipation and excitement even, and that's really what it is. And it's that combination of pressure and responsibility that you have to deliver, because one is in court every weekday, and you can't take that job lightly, to be honest. That's the beauty of the profession, that whether it's a young lawyer or a super senior lawyer, the expectation and the preparation is the same. If anything, as you grow in the profession, you're expected to prepare and deliver at higher standards. So it's really, I think, if not pressure, the sense of responsibility that you have a job to do, and your job impacts others, right? When you're in court, cases have a direct impact on people's lives in a real sense. And I think it's that edge that wakes me up. Yeah.
Wow. Super. You know, one of the nice things I saw also when just going through your bio and, you know, a lot of things I read on the net, this amicus curiae, you know, so you have to be a special person to be invited by the court as a friend of the court to sort matters out. So how does that work? If you can just give us a snapshot into that.
Special person or not, essentially it's a special role to play, because you're not an advocate for a petitioner or a respondent in an adversarial sense. You're, as the phrase amicus curiae translates, it means a friend of the court. So you're really appointed to assist the court objectively without taking sides, either on a pure point of law, or many times in matters of larger public interest where there is an interface of law, public policy, governance, oversight, etc. And yes, it is a privileged opportunity for any counsel. One values it, and I've been privileged to have been amicus in a few cases, including more recently the matter relating to proceedings against members of parliament and members of the Legislative Assembly. It's actually a case that the Supreme Court has requested the High Courts to take up. And each of those cases brings a very different perspective to you as a professional, because you distance yourself from sides. Our advocacy otherwise is adversarial, right? In most cases, you're bound to take a side, however objective you may be. But here is a brief where you're really, in a sense, an adjunct of the court. So it's a privilege, it's an important responsibility, because if the court appoints you as amicus, it expects you to rise to that brief and to be completely prepared, fully on top of things, assisting the court on a daily basis. And often enough, the material that you place before the court can become the basis of the judgment that the court passes in those cases. So an amicus brief, yes, is a very unique and a special role that one is called upon to do, and there's a lot of learning to be made as counsel in that role.
So I'm going to go back to your under 15 cricket. You would have had to be at a super standard to even, I'm saying, play at that level. So that would have been one draw, especially since in India, you know, cricket is religion almost. So then you have this parting ways. What was the thought process at that time to give up the sport and go into, you know, serious studies?
Personally, for me, Ian, it wasn't a very difficult decision, because at the state level, quite honestly, I was a fringe player. I don't think I was such a talent that I was, getting picked for the asking. I hadn't played state under 13, for example. For those who want to play serious cricket, you need to have made it at the under 13 level. It's only the rare cases that you get picked up later. So my first experience playing for the state actually was at the under 15 level. I was an opening bat, but we had a couple of more talented cricketers in the lineup. J. Arun Kumar, who played for state, even coached the state at a senior level, and Girish Rao, who was also a very good left-hand bat. So I was really the third choice. So for me personally, it was not a difficult choice to make, to walk away from serious cricket. To be honest, it's not like the Indian cricket team was waiting for me. But yeah, it felt good. It felt good to be picked to play competitive state cricket. It was a very different experience for me. Having played at school level, the difference was there to see. And I remember that in our year, there was actually nobody else from the ICSE schools actually who played under 15. It was quite surprising. So it was culturally also a new learning for me. there were lots of guys from the Mofussil areas. That turnover was happening. I made friends who were from different parts of the state. Very hardy guys. I don't think we had that mettle that they did. So yeah, it was a real learning experience for me. It was a lesson in humility, to be honest, to see where real talent lies, because one had to look beyond the immediate circle. And at one point, I think the choice was made for me because I was finally picked to play against Bombay in the quarterfinals, and Bombay at that time had some real talent.
Mhm.
I mean, just above us were guys like Sachin and Kambli and so on, And in our time, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but I think guys like Amol Mazumdar and so on used to play for Bombay in our age bracket. So it was a real breakthrough for me to finally be picked for the side, and the newspapers had my name as well. But the difficult part was that it was going to clash with my ICSE board exams. And I think the choice was made that I was certainly not going to be a long-term cricketer. So I had to, at that stage, walk away from competitive cricket and pursue my education. Yeah.
So one thing also that comes across from your persona is your niceness, your groundedness. Would you like to say something about that? I mean, a person in law who has achieved this much, you'd probably walk, with your head in the air or above the clouds. You don't seem to be that kind of person. Can you tell us what makes you so grounded?
I don't know, Ian. I think it's maybe, of course, it's a personal and a personality trait that people have. I mean, I probably learned it at school, in quietness and confidence shall be your strength. I think it's a phrase that you can relate to. But more than that, I think life experience. I've been in court long enough to know that nobody can really strut around with their head in the air, because it's a competitive place. If you're not fully on the ball, you can be exposed pretty quickly, and then your head's not going to be in the air any longer. So I think it's better to have a slightly humble and a grounded approach to things, and people respect that too. I get personally put off with people who have pretense and noise about them, and I think you'll agree with me that the noisy ones are usually trying to cover up something. And yeah, that's where I come from.
Wow, thank you for calling that out. A lot of people don't realize this. So, Adi, also I wanted to say one thing. Family, I see you all so bonded, so close together. Does that family bonds also play a role in this humility, in this way you look at life?
I mean, yes and no. Personally, from my dad, my dad, he's a decent human being. I've learned that from him, that over and above everything else, it's important to first be a decent person. And it may be a cliched, old school kind of take on things, but I think over the years, I've realized how important that is. And all things being equal, that should set you apart from others. So yes, of course, there's a family influence, and there's a great deal of love and affection that we share. Ravina and Sundar, and we're indeed close-knit. But it's not like we're an everyday family, right? We live separately. We meet once in a way. Of course, I see my dad more often than I see my sister and brother-in-law. My niece is now in London. We love each other dearly. But ours is not a everyday family in the sense we're not a joint family. We don't live together. But it's true that there's a certain core that we share. And of course, that rubs off on you.
Being such a busy person, Aditya, how did you get time to do this, journaling of the school history and all that? That must have taken tons of time.
It did, Ian, but it was very enriching in the sense, I think it's important for any professional to have constructive hobbies on the side, constructive distractions, if you will, where you can take your mind off work, but at the same time, you can keep learning and growing. And for me, research was an important facet. And I didn't personally take my studies at law school seriously enough, to be honest. I was an accidental lawyer. So I tried to make up for that by doing a bit of academia just for the love of it. So even my PhD, which I did, was in political science. I did it by the side. Of course, it takes a lot out of you, but it teaches you a lot as well. And with the books, it was a labor of love. There were books that I did on the school They came with also a need to fill certain voids in terms of, archives and history, which I think old institutions like Joseph's, Cotton's deserve, right? Our schools deserve that. And I felt that void needed to be filled in terms of having well-researched books on them. I don't know how much I've been able to deliver, but it was great fun going back in time, 150 years of the history of Cotton's being set up in 1865, and that transition of the city as well, right? How Bangalore grew from being, a pre-independence cantonment to a city in the 60s when, my folks were here, to what it is today. And all of us who are attached to Bangalore also enjoy that metamorphosis. Sometimes we don't enjoy it. It's probably changed for the worse in many ways. But all of that was very enjoyable. So yeah, these things take time, but they add value as well.
So this transition point on, you said something very interesting. You said I'm an accidental lawyer. I'm thinking wow, you have reached this height of fame in the law profession, but you have the humility to say I was an accidental lawyer. So can you just give us a little more depth into that?
Yeah, it's true. Ian, I mean, I'm a first generation lawyer. My dad is a businessman, and I honestly went to the law school more because it was a promising young institution in Bangalore. I had plans to go to the UK. Those plans didn't materialize, and I ended up staying on in Bangalore. That's really what happened. And as a result of that, I was a bit begrudged by the fact that my plans hadn't happened. Everyone else from school was, going off to the UK or to the US. And I was a bit upset by that, to be honest. And I had no real calling towards the law. But obviously that changes with time. I mean, it's a 5-year course. And from the time you join when you're about 18 to the time when you graduate, you do grow up. And towards my 4th year and my final year, I realized that now the stuff is real. Mm-hmm. You can't sort of live in denial. And yeah, in that sense, I woke up late. There's no doubt about it. I was paranoid when I started my practice. Maybe that's the answer to your question. You talk about me being grounded and so on, because I know that I've come from a place of very little learning personally. I was underprepared when I started at the bar. I know that my colleagues were far better, practically and academically inclined, and I had to cover up a lot of that quite quickly. So yeah, in that sense, I'm certainly an accidental lawyer, but I can say this much, that once I chose to practice and got into it, then there was no looking back. Then there was no sort of, fence sitting. One was clear and went for it.
Wow. So this is almost starting out of fear, where, oh God, everybody is better, equipped than me, but you had to make that much more effort. And this is really what this program is about. It's about how does that turning point happen, when everything changes, including you being asked to write on the Oxford Handbook for the Indian Constitution. I mean, that itself is such a big, placement. Yeah. So how did that come about?
Of course, the invitation to contribute to the Oxford Handbook came much later, and I had taught constitutional law at law school and done a few talks and written. And one of my students, who's himself now a very eminent scholar of constitutional law, Madhav Khosla, he was the one who reached out to me. He's one of the co-editors. And he reached out to me and he curated different sorts of jurists and practicing lawyers to contribute to it. And it was a great pleasure to be part of that process. But your question actually relates to the time when I actually started out. And I think that is an important message to anyone, that you don't have to have all the answers on day one.
Yeah.
It's okay to figure things out. And as much as I may have been, distracted through law school, but one also had fun in college. And I try and say that to people. You can have a good time. You don't have to be, topping your class and churning out this fat CV from day one. There's more to life. And if you've played sport and you've, traveled and made friends and had a bit of fun, your life's that much the richer for it. And it's okay if you figure things out a bit later, as long as you have the big answers clear, right? I'm a strong believer in that, Ian, that you need to get certain life choices in place at the right time. So for me, that life choice was that, I do want to be a lawyer, maybe not on day one, but at least by the time I was graduating, I was sure that I wanted to be a lawyer. more importantly, I wanted to be a practicing lawyer, right? So that's a big toss-up that young law students have, whether to be corporate lawyers, in-house lawyers, to be in academia, or to be in court. And I'm glad that at least those big questions were sorted in my mind early enough. And if you get that clarity early, the rest will fall into place. It's fine. It's fine. I mean, you will, of course, have to catch up. In any case, in practice, you have to learn on the job. I don't think any law school anywhere in the world can prepare you for what lies in court, to be honest. So you need to have that confidence that you can do it on your own. And if you've got those conceptual issues clear in your mind, you'll figure things out. And I think for me, that's an important message that needs to go out to people, because they put a lot of pressure on themselves for no good reason, to be honest. What actually conversely happens then is people tend to burn out a little faster.
Right.
If you haven't enjoyed school life, I mean, we were playing BT Ramaiah cricket matches till 2 days before ICSE. You know, my English teacher used to blast me and say, when will you ever stop playing cricket? But it was fine. It was good to juggle many balls, you know, to be able to learn faster, to learn under pressure. It's okay if you haven't been cramming the whole year and you just sort of prepare 2 days before your exam. It's okay, you will get by. And that teaches you a lot, I think. And that to me personally has been the learning. And I try and convey that as much as I can, that it's okay not to have everything in place. In fact, nobody does, right? How much ever you prepare through university and so on, the real world is different. And you're not going to be prepared completely for things that lie ahead, and you've got to learn on the job.
Looking ahead, Aditya, what is the road ahead look for you? You know, personal, professional, everything. What are the top of your head?
Let's see, Ian. I mean, I'm at crossroads. Let's see what lies ahead. I'm enjoying practice. I love the practice of the law. I love the study of the law. Let's see, my PhD paper that I had written is yet to be published, so hopefully I can publish that sometime. In fact, the lockdown was a good time for me to convert my paper into something that can be a little more readable, you know. So I spent the first 3 months of the lockdown actually just slogging away on my paper and converted it into a more readable text, I think. So hopefully I'll be able to publish it. At a personal level, I'm missing travel a lot, so hopefully one can go back to traveling again. Doesn't look like it. Things are not great at all, especially if you're looking at international travel. I think that's out of the question for a while. But yeah, one step at a time. I think probably COVID has taught us to take things
That's so brilliant. Yeah.
slow. Not everything can be long-term plans.
Not to make long-term plans. Yeah, that's one thing which clearly came out in this whole thing is COVID.
Yeah.
You know, we use the term VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Sure.
And really, COVID has demonstrated that. I've been talking about this for the last 10 years. But now I don't need to talk about it anymore. Everybody knows what a VUCA world is. So, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. So yeah, I love what you just said. And plus, you're the kind of person, I see that, you know, you're not going to fret over things, even if something falls. So tell me, how do you handle, let's say, failure or adversity? What's your trick for that?
Look, adversity is part of life. In fact, adversity has taught me more than anything else. I've faced adversity in different ways. I lost my mom when I was 11. And I think you knew my mom.
Yes.
So, and
Yes.
in many ways, you know.
That was a shock for all of us.
Yeah. And I was very deeply attached to her, as would any son be to his mother, I think. And that was my first taste of adversity. And it was a very radical taste of adversity. In many ways, that's been a turning point for me, because I knew I had to toughen up. I wasn't tough. I'd moved to Cotton Boys, which is an all-boys school from Sophia's. You know, I was still adjusting to the rough weather of being in a boys' school and all of that. And I lost my mom when I was in my 6th standard, and yeah, that woke me up. And I've tried to internalize that, and I've had many such bumps. Maybe not touchwood as drastic as that, but one's faced a heck of a lot of adversity along the way, and litigation is tough. It tests you in many ways. When you set up your own practice, things are very tough. It tests who you are as a person. You may be a decent professional, but I think your personal mettle has to be tough to live through those days when, you know, work is not coming your way, recognition is not happening, money is not coming your way. Things can get very existential for you. You actually start reflecting on your life choices when you go independent as a lawyer. But I think you deal with it with your sheer bloody mindedness, if nothing else. You just decide to stick it out and see what happens. And I think that's a not a bad trait to have, to, you know, let things fall in place. And I think importantly, people should realize that it's very easy to make excuses and blame situations and blame people and blame others for your problems. That's the easy way out. Then adversity gets the better of you. But I think one has to be more circumspect, take things on the chin, and try and get past adversity on your own. And I've learned that over time, and that certainly helps. Yeah.
Has there been anything that you would say is your biggest failing in life, and did you pick up something from it that made you a better person? I'm almost seeing a spiritual side to you, Aditya. So, you know, not just with the look, okay? The look is just part of it. but overall, I'm just saying, you seem just so spiritual. You know, you can even just put on some orange robes and become a guru today. It looks like that. So just tell us, you know, what happened there?
In terms of failings, is your question?
If there was a big failing that helped, you know, you to get this better, deeper view of life. I don't know if there's something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I could have been better prepared for every station in my life, right? That was my own doing. Maybe I thought I was too cool or so on. It helps to talk to people. There have been many phases in my career where I would have been lighter, you know. I would have been better off if I had either taken things lightly or at least spoken to others, vented a little bit, got perspective from others. I tried to do too much on my own, to be honest, which feels good at one level, but I think it helps also to have sounding boards. It helps to be slightly better prepared. So for example, I told you that when I left law school, I was nowhere near prepared for the real world. But even when I went independent, which is your next big station, right? When you set up your own practice, I think it would have helped to be slightly better prepared for that. Mentally, emotionally, practically, to be better prepared to face what lies ahead. That would have eased things for me. So yeah, I think knowledge is power, and being prepared and ready for situations takes the edge off the pressure that you face. And I try and tell that to my colleagues and juniors also, that if you're able to anticipate situations a bit better and have a little more ammunition on hand, that certainly makes life easier.
Thank you so much. That's a deep answer. Can you explain to me one thing, because it's coming through on your talk and on our discourse right now. You don't seem to be, almost like a man of the world. It's almost like, you're in some sort of a realm higher than everyone. So almost like a self-actualization mode. I don't know whether I'm getting it wrong, but it's almost like you reach there. So, you're not really bothered about anything, but you do your hard work. You want to contribute to society. Where did that happen?
Oh, that's high praise, Ian. I'm not sure I deserve it, but at one level, I've been a loner. Maybe it comes from there. That is actually directly related to my having lost my mom early, because my dad did a terrific job being a single parent after my mom passed on. But at one level, he had his own loss to deal with, right? And my mom passed away when she was about 44 or 45.
Yeah.
So in many ways, my dad and I had our own grief to deal with, and that did, yes, make me a loner in a way. And and that's been the case. I live alone. I enjoy my own time. I mean, people have told me you live in your own head. I don't know if they mean that as a compliment or not, but yeah, I think a lot of answers are to be found within. I keep hearing people saying that, I want to find myself. That's easier said than done, right? You're not going to find yourself in everyday terms. You're going to have to get out of your comfort. You're going to have to be in the deep. You're going to have to be scared at times. Only then will your real self reveal itself to you. And I've enjoyed that process. And at the end of the day, we are pretty much on our own, right here. I mean, people have got their own things to deal with. It's good to be there for others. It's good to have people there for you. But at the end of the day, I do think we've got to figure out a lot of things on our own. And maybe that's also true of our profession. Maybe I can make that connection, because advocacy, as you'll appreciate, is also in a sense, like being a fighter. You're on your own at the end of the day in court with all the assistance that you may have, etc. You're pretty much doing your own thing. There's nowhere to hide or to run. And you're judged, right? You're judged by a judge. Your opponents are going to test you every day. Your clients and your peers and your colleagues and your interns are all going to judge you. And they're sometimes going to judge you quite harshly. And they will see you for what you are. So that, perforce makes you try and be the best version of yourself. And yeah, that's what it is.
So being in law, Aditya, this is where I'm going to go next is, how do you prepare for the pressure that you have to face? Do you do something, meditation, exercise? Is there anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, of course. I do exercise. I walk quite a bit. I used to swim pre-COVID, which is a great way to clear your mind. But I think more than the physical exercise bit of things, I think the best way to deal with the pressure of the law is to prepare. No amount of frills can make up for that. The better prepared you are with your brief, the lesser the pressure there will be on you. That I've certainly learned. Because after all, where does the pressure come from? The pressure comes from the uncertainty, right? And that uncertainty is really what? It's something either that your opponent will spring up that you didn't anticipate, or it will be a question that the court puts to you, which you didn't see coming. But if you're more closely attached to the brief, your preparation is more thorough, by and large, you would have already covered those points in your mind. And if you've done it, I think that to a large extent takes the pressure off you as a counsel. Of course, this is again easier said than done, because this has been a journey of many years. The pressure in the early days was much sharper. When you're setting up your practice, your clients are your own, you have limited work, you're worried about where you stand, there's a different subconscious subliminal pressure. And that's not just going to go away. I'm afraid one has to endure it. And it, it's a process. It goes away in time. But with the passage of time, now at least I've realized with more than 22 years at the bar, that if you've done your preparation and you're slightly detached, I firmly believe that you have to be slightly detached from your brief as well. There's a fantastic book that I read of a surgeon, Dr. Henry Marsh, a leading neurosurgeon in the UK. And he says, I can't be attached to my patient's problems, because if I am, I can't go back the next day and perform my surgery, right? If that's eating away at me. And I think that's important too, that you take your case seriously, you work hard at it, but you don't make other people's problems your own. You can't do that. You have to sympathize, even empathize with people, but you can't get personally involved in people's.
That's good, yes.
Because if you do that, then that pressure will finish you off.
Wow. I'm going to shift track slightly, Aditya, if you don't mind. One quick question on, you said something about your doctoral, your thesis, but you didn't give us what was the subject. But I'm assuming it will be a combination of something to do with constitution. But I just wanted to know, if you had to advise India, as the advisor for India, let's say, Parliament or whatever, what is the one or two things that you would advise us to do on let's say, a law level or a constitutional level? I don't know. I'm just going to keep it open-ended.
Actually, my PhD was in political science. I didn't even do it in the law per se, because I wanted to look at other parts of academia, and I enjoyed political science. My thesis was on civil-military relations in India and Pakistan, and I compared the two systems and tried to understand why it is that in Pakistan their democracy failed right from the beginning, and the army had its say. Even now it does, maybe to a slightly lesser degree. And how is it that we progressed as a liberal democracy over the years? And I tried to look at a slightly unsung institution, which is the military, right? the military in India in some ways doesn't get its due.
That's true.
Because it's been a passive institution. But I've tried to say that you have to also acknowledge the role that passive institutions have played. Both the armed forces in India and Pakistan were born of the same force at one time, right?
That's true.
So how is it that they went so diametrically different? And that's really been the hypothesis that I try to present in my paper. And yeah, in terms of a message, what I tried to say in my conclusions is that we have to be proud of our democracy. We have to be proud of our institutions. We have to be proud of the spirit that we share as Indians, our democratic spirit. It's important. It's not an accident. It's happened by design. People have worked towards it, right? Institutions and individuals. And one must give regard to passive institutions as well. And when you make the comparison with Pakistan, that becomes quite stark.
Stark, very stark. Yeah. But some of it also is due to propaganda, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure whether that came across, or did you actually go there, do some research?
No, I didn't personally visit Pakistan for it. It was basically, honestly, I didn't have the time. So my PhD was done while I was practicing. So I had to really eke out time for it. So it was largely based on secondary material.
Right.
But there's a lot of writing on Pakistan actually, because the issue of civil-military relations is more, in your face in Pakistan, as it were, because more than half their history has had military generals in power. So naturally, the amount of writing and scholarship and the biographies and so on are more directly related to the topic. So there's a lot of material available in public libraries and so on, which sheds light on it. Lesser so in India, because in India, really what I'm talking about is a non-event. So people don't like to or tend to talk about non-events that much, but sometimes non-events are also important.
No, you're right. It could change history in a lot of cases.
True.
So if you had to give some advice to our youth today, I'm picking up so many plus points from your talk today. One is, take life as it comes, one day at a time. And that's reinforced now by COVID, where, the VUCA world analogy appears. But also this groundedness, you could lose. For instance, I just had this brain surgery. I mean, it just happened like that. So, there's no time to prepare for it. But my kind of work, I'm saying, boss, okay, let's get it over and done with. And I want to get out of hospital and I want to start my work. So what kind of tips can you give just to live a good life or to be a good citizen, whatever you like, Aditya, because you seem almost like I said, this spiritually grounded, legal eagle. And I thought, let's just get your viewpoint. How does it work?
I'm sorry, I didn't know you went through this procedure, Ian. I hope you're...
Oh, I'm fine. It's like 3 weeks plus. If you can see this nice scar here.
Wow.
It just makes me look a little tougher, and I'm quite fine with that.
You've always been one of the fittest guys I know.
No, my fitness saved me, if you ask me.
Yeah, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm fabulous. And in fact, I'm busy with my work more than before.
Fantastic.
Because I'm saying, boss, I have a mission and I'm going to complete a lot of things.
Actually, that is in many ways the message. But if you ask me, I would say, don't make lazy and safe life choices. A lot of people do that, and I find that irritating, especially with people around us who have so much privilege, right? Go to good schools, you go to good colleges, you're reasonably well off. You have a lot of stuff at your disposal. You've got to make it count, man. There's no point making a lame choice and letting it all just be. To me personally, that annoys me the most. I really don't, in the long run, care how it goes, right? I mean, success and so on is relative, but I have a lot of time for people who make the right life choices, who take a risk, go outside of their comfort. I give credit to my dad. He never pushed me to join the family business. And I think he knew at one level I was not going to do that as well. So yeah, from my life experience, I can say do that first. First, make the value choice, make the hard life choice. The rest will follow. But if you're going to make a safe choice, you're going to make a lazy choice, you're going to draw a very small square around you and say, I'm going to live within it, then the whole adventure and the creativity and the process is restricted, right? Time will fly by. I mean, you talked about times when we knew each other. We're talking about 25 years ago, probably, when we used to meet socially and so on. And time's flown by. And unless your canvas is broad and your imagination is there, then the rest is really not going to happen. So yeah, I think that's an important message I would like to convey.
Can I shoot out 5-6 quick questions to you?
Sure.
Okay. A person like you, do you feel that you could do 10 times more by making one difference somewhere? Or are you saying, if it happens, it happens? You already said that earlier, but I just wanted to know if there's one thing that could change and give you a wider vista, what would that one change be?
I think it's about committing to more difficult choices in your profession. And when you have that choice, you should make it. And for me, yeah, that's what it is. I know that at different points in my career, those choices have presented themselves to me. I've tried to take them, and that remains my mantra, that if those choices come to me and I take them at the right time, then things should be better. Yeah.
If you were the Prime Minister, one thing you would change?
I have to think about this.
How important is education?
Value education, I think, is crucially important. Substantive education, I think, in many ways is overrated because I don't know how analytical education is at every level and how impartial it is also, right? So one has to ask those questions. But value education, I think, is crucially important. It's what makes it.
That you learnt in school, and who would you like to appreciate for that?
I learned that character was critical, and it was important to first be a no-nonsense person. And I would credit that to a lot of my teachers, my principal. Since your talk is on leadership, I remember my principal, Dr. Francis Samuel. If you'll permit me,
yes, please.
A little anecdote. In my 11th standard, I was shortlisted to be captain of school, but I wasn't sure I would make it, right? And nobody campaigned and stuff for these things. And one day he just called us to the dining hall, the guys who were designated prefects, and he looked at me and he said, "Sondi, take over." 3 words, and that was enough, because as a 17-year-old, or 16-year-old, in fact, at that time, if a principal had faith in me to just say 3 words and say take over, it meant a lot. So yeah, I think character more than anything else.
That is awesome. So Aditya, I've learned a ton of stuff from you, and let me tell you, the things that really stand out is, for me, ultimately, I feel people who are humble are the great people. So greatness brings humility along with it, and you can't be great unless you're humble. So that's one of my philosophies. I'm going to take that back from you, and you epitomize that. The second thing I'd like to say is, you come across as such a nice guy. So I'm thinking, as an advocate, if you'd probably prefer to be the arbitrator in the issue rather than the judge. So I'm thinking, hey guys, come sit down, we'll sort it out type.
You'll be surprised. I'm actually quite a handful in court.
Yeah, but that is because you take your role so seriously. But I'm saying, if you had a choice of getting 2 guys to sit down and sort out matters, I think you would do that.
At one level, yes. I mean, there are many disputes which should not go in court, and they give you great satisfaction when they settle. Family disputes, partnership disputes, and so on. But then there are some which are meant for court, and there's no question of middle path, right?
Yeah. And I'm saying, sometimes greatness is not chased, but it's sometimes thrust upon you. And you seem the correct candidate for something like that. That you don't have to look for anything. Just like you got school captain, just with 3 words, take over. So I thought, wow. So I've learned a lot from you, and I'm sure people analyzing this small chit chat that we had are going to learn a lot more.
Thank you. And I've really enjoyed chatting with you and reconnecting with you, actually, in a sense.
Thank you so much.
Long overdue.
A lot of gratitude, and more than anything else, honored to be talking to a great soul like you. Thank you so much, Aditya. And we will catch up sometime soon.
Thank you. Take care.